stood on the porch of the house I'd paid for, staring at a lock I didn't recognize. My key wouldn't turn. I tried it again, slower this time, thinking maybe I was just exhausted from the funeral. Maybe my hands were shaking too much. But no. The lock had been changed. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. The door opened just wide enough for Derek's face to appear. He was my late wife's oldest son, 34 years old. He looked at me the way you'd look at a solicitor. "What do you want?" he said. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I didn't understand the question. "What do I want?" "I live here, Derek." "Not anymore," he said. "This was Mom's house, and now it's ours." Then he closed the door. I stood there for a long time. I could hear voices inside. His brother, probably. Maybe his wife. I heard a television. I heard someone laugh. I didn't knock again. I walked back to my car, got in, and sat there in the driveway. My driveway. The one I'd had resurfaced 2 years ago because Margaret said the cracks made it look shabby. The one where I'd taught Kyle how to change a tire when he was 23. The one where Derek had parked his truck every single day for the past 11 years without ever once offering to help with the mortgage. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat there trying to make sense of what had just happened. The funeral had been that morning. We'd buried Margaret in the cemetery next to the church where we'd gotten married. I'd chosen the plot myself. I'd paid for everything. The casket, the flowers, the reception afterward at the community center. Derek and Kyle had shown up in wrinkled suits. They'd stood by the grave and cried. People had hugged them and told them how sorry they were for their loss. No one had hugged me. At the reception, Derek's wife, a woman named Shayna, who I'd met maybe 3 times, had made a speech about how Margaret was the best mother-in-law anyone could ask for. Kyle had nodded along, his eyes red. I'd sat in the corner with a paper plate of food I didn't eat. And now, 6 hours later, I was locked out of my own home. Margaret and I had been married for 11 years. When I met her, she was drowning. Not literally, but financially, emotionally, practically. She had 2 sons in their 20s, no career, no savings, and an ex-husband who had disappeared years earlier. She was working 2 jobs just to keep a small apartment in a bad part of town. I was 56, a widower. My first wife, Linda, had died of cancer 5 years before, and I'd spent those years alone in a house that felt too big. When I met Margaret at a church fundraiser, I wasn't looking for someone to save. I was just looking for company. But she needed help. That was obvious. And I was in a position to give it. I'm a civil engineer. I worked for the county for 30 years before I retired. I owned my home outright, a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and low crime. I had a pension, some savings, a few investments. Nothing extravagant, but I was comfortable, secure. Margaret wasn't. Her apartment had mold in the bathroom. Her car broke down every other month. She had credit card debt from years of just trying to survive. She worked as a receptionist during the day and cleaned offices at night. Her sons lived with her and contributed nothing. So when we got married, I made sure she would be taken care of. I paid off her credit card debt, almost $18,000. I bought her a reliable car, a used Honda with low mileage. I added her to my health insurance. I brought her and her 2 sons into my home. Derek was 23 then. His brother Kyle was 21. Both of them were drifting. Neither had finished college. Derek had done a 1.5 years at community college before dropping out. Kyle had never even enrolled. Both worked part-time jobs they hated and spent their free time playing video games in my basement. Margaret cried when she moved in. She said she'd been so afraid she'd end up on the street. She said I'd saved her life. I told her she didn't need to think like that anymore. I told her she was safe now. I told her that everything I had was hers too. But there was always a distance. They never called me by my name. They never called me anything, really. When they had to address me, they'd just start talking and hope I'd figure out they meant me. Margaret said that was normal. She said they were still adjusting. She said they'd lost their father early and didn't know how to relate to a stepfather. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I tried to build something with them. I offered to help Derek fix his credit so he could get an apartment of his own. I offered to co-sign a loan for Kyle when he said he wanted to start a landscaping business. They never followed through. Derek said he wasn't ready to move out. He said rent was too expensive. Kyle said the landscaping thing was just an idea, nothing serious. But Margaret was happy, and that was enough for me. I'd spend evenings with her on the couch watching television, talking about our day. She'd tell me about the people at her office. I'd tell her about the projects I was consulting on. I'd kept a few small clients after retirement, just to stay busy. She'd fall asleep with her head on my shoulder. Those were good years. I didn't mind that her sons were still in the house. I didn't mind that they ate my food and used my electricity and never once thanked me for it. I told myself they were young. I told myself they'd figure it out eventually. After the wedding, I thought Derek and his new wife would move out, get their own place, start their own life. They didn't. Shayna moved into the basement with Derek. They took over the spare room down there and turned it into a bedroom. They hung curtains. They brought in furniture. Margaret said it was temporary. She said they were saving for a down payment. I didn't argue, but they never saved anything. Derek was still working the same part-time job at a hardware store. Shayna worked at a call center. Together they made maybe $30,000 a year, and they spent every cent. I'd see the delivery boxes pile up by the front door. Amazon, Target, clothes, electronics, things they didn't need. Margaret would say they were young and enjoying life. I'd say nothing. Kyle, meanwhile, was still in the basement too, still working part-time, still playing video games until 2 in the morning. At night, I'd lie in bed and listen to the sounds from downstairs. Voices, laughter, the thump of music through the floor. And I'd think about how this was supposed to be my retirement. I was supposed to travel with Margaret, see the country, visit national parks, maybe take a cruise. Instead, I was supporting 4 adults. But I didn't say anything, because Margaret was happy, and I loved her. Margaret got sick in the spring of our 10th year together. It started with fatigue, then weight loss, then pain she couldn't explain. By the time they found the cancer, it was already stage 4, pancreatic. The oncologist said she had maybe a year. She lasted 8 months. I took care of her the entire time. I retired completely so I could be home with her. I learned how to manage her medication schedule, 12 different pills at different times of the day. I learned how to help her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk on her own. I learned how to change bandages and clean wounds and stay calm when she cried from the pain. Derek and Kyle visited on weekends. Sometimes. They'd come upstairs from the basement, sit with her for 20 minutes, ask how she was feeling, then go back downstairs to watch TV. Margaret never complained. She said they were busy. She said they were scared. She said it was hard for them to see her like this. I didn't argue. But I noticed. I noticed when they stopped visiting altogether in the last month. I noticed when they didn't return my calls to tell them she'd gotten worse. I noticed when they didn't come to the hospital until after she'd already passed. Derek cried at the funeral. So did Kyle. People hugged them and said how hard this must be. No one asked how I was doing. I watched the cemetery workers lower the casket into the ground. I watched them cover it with dirt. When I finally got back to the house, Derek's truck was already in the driveway. I went inside. The house was full of people. Friends from church, neighbors, Margaret's co-workers. Someone handed me a plate of food. Someone else hugged me and said something I didn't hear. Derek and Kyle were in the living room, surrounded by people offering condolences. I went upstairs. I sat on the bed Margaret and I had shared for 11 years. I stayed there until everyone left. Her credit cards, the life insurance policy I'd taken out on her years ago, which would help cover the funeral costs, but not much else. I thought about calling Derek and Kyle, sitting them down, talking about next steps. But I didn't. I just drank my coffee and stared out the window. Around noon, I decided to drive into town, run some errands, get out of the house. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. That's when I noticed the basement door was closed. It was never closed. I opened it and called down. Derek? Kyle? No answer. I went downstairs. The basement was empty. Their beds were made. Their clothes were gone. They'd moved out. I stood there for a long time trying to understand. Then I went back upstairs, got in my car, and drove to the bank. I'd set them up years ago after we got married. I wanted her to feel secure. I wanted her to know she had access to everything. The bank was quiet. I sat down with a representative, a young woman named Emily who'd helped me with refinancing a few years back. I need to review my accounts, I said. My wife just passed, and I need to make sure everything's in order. Emily offered her condolences. Then she pulled up my information. Her expression changed. "Is something wrong?" I asked. She hesitated. "Mr. Carter, it looks like there was a large withdrawal from your savings account 2 weeks ago." "How large?" $43,000. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "That's not possible," I said. "I didn't authorize that." Emily turned the screen toward me. The withdrawal was made in person, by Margaret Carter. I stared at the screen. Margaret had been in the hospital 2 weeks ago. She'd been barely conscious. She couldn't have gone to the bank. "Are you sure?" I asked. Emily checked again. "Yes. It says here she presented ID and withdrew the funds in the form of a cashier's check." "A check made out to who?" Emily scrolled down. "Derek Hollis and Kyle Hollis." She'd been in pain. She'd been on heavy medication. And somehow she'd gone to the bank and withdrawn $43,000, money I'd saved over 30 years, and given it to her sons. I called Derek. No answer. I called Kyle. No answer. I drove home. The house was quiet. I went upstairs and sat on the bed. I tried to remember if Margaret had said anything, if she'd mentioned the money, if she'd told me what she was planning. But there was nothing. She'd just done it. Richard was a lawyer I'd worked with years ago on county projects, semi-retired now but still sharp. I explained the situation, the withdrawal, the money, the fact that Derek and Kyle had moved out without saying a word. Richard was quiet for a long time. "Tom," he said finally, "did Margaret have access to all your accounts?" "Yes, we were married. I added her to everything. And you didn't have any separate accounts? Anything in just your name?" "No. I wanted her to feel like we were equals." Richard sighed. That was generous. But it also means she had every legal right to withdraw that money. Even if she was dying? Even if she wasn't thinking clearly? Unless you can prove she was mentally incompetent at the time, and that's very hard to prove, then yes, she had the right. I didn't say anything. "I'm sorry, Tom," Richard said, "but there's not much you can do about the money." "What about the house?" "What about it? Derek and Kyle moved out yesterday without warning, and now I'm wondering if they're planning something." "Like what?" "I don't know," I said. "But Margaret's name is on the deed, and if she left the house to them, did she have a will?" "I don't think so." Another pause. "Tom, if Margaret died without a will, her estate, including her share of the house, would pass to her heirs under state law. That means her sons." "But I paid for the house. I've been paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance, everything." "I understand. But legal ownership and financial contribution aren't always the same thing. Let me pull the deed and see how the property was titled. That'll tell us where you stand." I thought about the first time we'd met, at that church fundraiser. She'd been standing by the dessert table looking lost. I'd offered her a cup of coffee. She'd smiled and said yes. I thought about our wedding. Small ceremony, just a few friends and family. Derek and Kyle had been there, uncomfortable in rented suits. I thought about the night she'd moved in, how she'd cried and said she finally felt safe. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the quiet evenings, the weekends, the routines we'd built. And I thought about how, in the end, none of it had mattered. She'd taken my money and given it to her sons. She'd made sure they were taken care of. And she'd left me with nothing. That means when Margaret died, her half didn't go into her estate, it became yours automatically. I felt something loosen in my chest. "So the house is mine?" "Not exactly." The looseness tightened again. "What do you mean?" The deed shows that you added Margaret as a joint tenant. But there's a complication. In this state, when a joint tenant dies, their interest passes to the surviving joint tenant, unless there's a competing claim. What kind of competing claim? If Margaret transferred her interest before she died, or if she created a trust, or if… Richard, I don't understand. Is the house mine or not? He hesitated. I need to do more research. But Tom, there's something else you should know. What? I called the county recorder's office. There was a deed filed 3 days before Margaret died. What kind of deed? A quitclaim deed, transferring Margaret's interest in the property to Derek and Kyle Hollis. I sat down. She gave them the house. She gave them her interest in the house, Richard said, which, if the deed is valid, means they now own 50%. How is that legal? She was dying. She was on medication. Unless you can prove she was incompetent, the deed stands, and proving incompetence after the fact is almost impossible. I felt something in my chest crack. So what does this mean? It means you own 50% of the house, and Derek and Kyle own the other 50%. So I can't sell it. I can't refinance it. I can't do anything without their permission. Correct. And they're not going to give me permission. Probably not. I closed my eyes. What are my options? Richard was quiet for a moment. You could try to buy them out, offer them cash for their share. I don't have cash. Margaret took everything. Then you could file a partition action, force a sale of the property and split the proceeds. How long would that take? Months, maybe a year. And how much would it cost? 10, maybe 15,000 in legal fees. I didn't have that either. There's one more thing, Richard said. What? You still have the right to live in the house. You're a co-owner. They can't kick you out without going through an eviction process, which they can't legally do if you're on the deed. So I just stay here and hope they don't make my life hell. Richard didn't answer. I found more notebooks, more receipts, more evidence of the plans she'd made without telling me. I found a letter she'd written to Derek. It was dated a month before she died. It said, I'm sorry I can't leave you more, but the house is yours now. Take care of it. Take care of each other and don't let him take it from you. Him. She meant me. About what? About the house, about your mother, about what happens now. What happens now, Derek said, is that you move out. I'm not moving out. I own half the house. You owned it. Now we own it. That's not how it works, Derek. Then take us to court. I don't want to take you to court. I just want to understand why. Why what? Why Mom gave us the house? Because it's what we deserved. We're her kids. You're just some guy she married. I didn't respond. You got 11 years, Derek said. You got to live rent-free off of Mom. Now it's over. Rent-free? I said. Derek, I paid for everything. I paid off your mother's debt. I bought her car. I supported you and your brother for a decade. We didn't ask you to. You didn't have to. You just took. Derek laughed. Yeah, we took. And now we're taking the house. So get out. He hung up. That night I sat in the living room with the lights off. I thought about calling Richard again. I thought about starting a legal battle. I thought about fighting. But I was tired. I was 67 years old. I'd spent the last year taking care of a dying woman. I'd buried my wife. I'd lost my savings. And now I was supposed to fight her sons for a house I'd paid for. I didn't have the energy. The next morning, I drove back to the house after picking up groceries. I parked in the driveway. I walked up to the front door. I put my key in the lock. It didn't turn. He'd already filed the emergency motion. They can't do this, Richard said. Even if they own half the property, they can't exclude you without due process. This is illegal. So what happens now? Now we get a sheriff's deputy to enforce your rights. When? Today. The deputy explained that he had a court order requiring Derek and Kyle to allow me immediate re-entry to the property and to return the original keys. Derek argued. He said the house was his. He said I had no right. The deputy didn't argue back. He just read the order aloud. Derek called Kyle. Kyle came upstairs. They both tried to explain that their mother had owned the house. The deputy said that didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd been illegally excluded. He told them they had two options: let me back in or be removed. Derek asked if he could call a lawyer. The deputy said yes, but he wasn't leaving until the situation was resolved. Derek made the call. 15 minutes later, Derek handed over a new key. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret. Someone had taken the sheets off the bed. The closet was half empty. They'd started going through her things. I didn't touch anything. I just closed the door and sat on the floor. Sometimes I'd hear them talking downstairs. I'd hear the TV. I'd hear them laugh. I didn't go down there. At night, I'd lie in bed and listen to the sounds from below. Footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing. And I'd think about how this house used to feel like home. Now it felt like a prison, not without a fight. And you can't force them out without going through a formal eviction process, which could take months. So I'm stuck. Not necessarily. There's another option. What? Sell the house. I almost laughed. Sell it? You'd have to negotiate with them, but if they agree, you could sell the property, split the proceeds, and walk away. Split the proceeds, I said, with the people who locked me out of my own home. I know it's not fair, Tom, but it might be the fastest way to move on. I thought about that. I thought about spending months, maybe years, fighting in court, spending money I didn't have, living in a house that felt hostile, or I could take the money and leave, start over. Let me think about it, I said. They looked up when I came down the stairs. I'm selling the house, I said. Derek blinked. What? I'm putting it on the market. You'll get your share. Then we're done. Kyle shook his head. You can't do that. Yes, I can, I said. It's joint property. I can force a sale. Derek stood up. This is Mom's house. No, I said. It was mine. I paid for it. I maintained it. I lived in it for 30 years before your mother even knew it existed. She lived in it because I invited her, and now you think you can take it. We're not taking anything, Derek said. It's ours, legally. Then you'll get your money when it sells, I said. Until then, stay out of my way. I turned and went back upstairs. It's a good property, she said. Well maintained. Good location. You should get asking price, maybe more. How long? I asked. 4 to 6 weeks if we're lucky. Make it faster. Richard told them they could accept the offer, or we'd go to court and force a partition sale, which would take longer and cost them more in legal fees. They accepted. When it was done, the agent handed us each a check. Derek looked at his, then at me. This is it, he said. That's your half, I said. Half of what you stole from us. I didn't respond. Kyle folded his check and put it in his pocket. Come on, he said to his brother. Let's go. They stood up. Derek paused at the door. I hope you're happy, he said. I looked at him. I'm not, I said, but I'm free. They left. I used my half of the sale, minus closing costs, minus legal fees, minus everything else, to buy a small condo across town. It's on the second floor of a quiet building. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen, a balcony that overlooks a parking lot. It's not much, but it's mine. I don't have much furniture yet, just a bed, a chair, a table, a few dishes, a coffee maker, but it's enough. I don't plan to. Sometimes I think about Margaret. I think about the life we had and the life I thought we'd have. I think about how much I gave and how little it mattered in the end. But I don't regret it. I loved her. I did my best. And maybe that's all anyone can do. I told her I was fine. She said Derek and Kyle had been telling people I'd abandoned them, that I'd kicked them out, that I'd stolen their inheritance. I didn't correct her. I just smiled and said I hoped they were doing well. Ellen looked at me for a long moment, then she said, You're a better man than most, Tom. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her and walked away. They think you have to fight, argue, scream, make someone pay. But I've learned that's not true. Sometimes justice is quiet. Sometimes it's just knowing that you did the right thing, even when no one else would. Sometimes it's walking away with your dignity intact. The furniture is sparse, the view isn't much, but when I sit on my balcony in the evening with a cup of coffee, I feel something I haven't felt in years. Peace. Just a statement of fact. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Margaret's car, the Honda I'd bought her 12 years ago, the one I'd maintained, paid insurance on, kept running when she couldn't afford to. They were selling it, and they thought I might want to know. I didn't respond. I don't know if they ever think about where it came from. I don't know if they ever think about me at all. And I've decided that I don't care. We didn't talk for a while, then he said, "Nice morning." "It is," I said. "You come here often?" "Most days." He nodded. "Me too. Since my wife passed. It's quiet here." "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be. She had a good life. We had a good life together." He opened his newspaper and started reading, and I sat there thinking about how simple that sounded. A good life together. Maybe that's all Margaret and I had. A good life together while it lasted. Maybe that's enough. Maybe they'll convince themselves that they deserved everything they got, that their mother was right to protect them, that I was just some guy who got in the way. Maybe they'll sleep well at night. I hope they do. Because I sleep well too. Not because I won, but because I know I did the right thing. I don't think I'm living well to spite anyone. I'm just living, one day at a time in a small condo with a view of a parking lot. And somehow that's enough.